March 9th, 1945, 17:30 hours, Northfield, Guam. Major General Curtis LeMay stood on the operations tower watching 334 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses prepare for takeoff. What none of the crews knew, what would only become clear in the briefing rooms just hours before departure, was that everything they had been trained to do was about to be thrown away. The precision daylight bombing doctrine that had defined American strategic air power since 1942 was about to be abandoned for a single night. In its place, LeMay was implementing the most radical tactical change of the Pacific War, a change so dangerous that his own staff had argued against it, so devastating that it would kill more people in 6 hours than the atomic bomb would kill at Hiroshima. The B-29s taxiing down the runway that evening carried no defensive ammunition for most of their guns. They would fly at 5,000 feet instead of their usual 30,000. They carried a new weapon that most crews had never used in combat, the M69 incendiary cluster bomb filled with jellied gasoline that would transform Tokyo into a furnace. LeMay had calculated that this single raid would either win the air war against Japan or end his career in disgrace. By dawn on March 10th, 16 square miles of Tokyo would be ash. Over 100,000 civilians would be dead. The largest single bombing raid in history would have rewritten the rules of strategic warfare, and LeMay would have proven that American industrial capacity could produce not just precision weapons, but apocalyptic destruction on a scale that made previous concepts of air power obsolete. The road to this moment had begun 5 months earlier with failure. When the first B-29s arrived in the Mariana Islands in October 1944, American planners believed they had finally found the weapon that would bring Japan to its knees without invasion. The Superfortress represented the pinnacle of American aviation technology. At 13 tons empty weight, it was the heaviest production aircraft ever built. Its 4 Wrighter 3350 engines produced 2,200 horsepower each, enough to carry a 20,000-pound bomb load over 1,500 miles. Its pressurized cabin allowed crews to operate at altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled to reach. Its central fire control system coordinated 5 gun turrets, mounting 12 50-caliber machine guns with a sophistication that made it the most heavily defended bomber in history. The 20th Air Force, created specifically to operate the B-29, had spent over $3 billion developing and deploying these aircraft. Each bomber cost $640,000, more than 3 times the price of a B-17 Flying Fortress. The supporting infrastructure on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam had transformed these tiny Pacific islands into the busiest airfields on Earth. Runways stretched for 2 miles across ground that had been jungle 6 months earlier. Fuel storage facilities held millions of gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline. Ammunition bunkers contained enough ordnance to level every city in Japan. Maintenance hangars employed thousands of mechanics working around the clock to keep the complex machines operational. The crews themselves represented the finest training American could provide. Pilots averaged 500 hours of flight time before their first combat mission. Bombardiers had practiced on ranges that replicated Japanese targets. Navigators could plot courses across thousands of miles of featureless ocean. These were not the hasty replacements that had filled bomber groups in Europe. They were specialists in the most advanced aircraft ever deployed. Yet by February 1945, after 4 months of operations, the results were catastrophic failures. Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, the original commander of the 21st Bomber Command, had implemented precision daylight bombing doctrine faithfully. B-29s flew at altitudes above 25,000 feet, where Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire were least effective. They attacked specific industrial targets, aircraft factories in Nagoya, steel mills in Osaka, engine plants in Tokyo. The bombardiers used the sophisticated Norden bomb sight, the device that had promised pinpoint accuracy from high altitude. The raids followed doctrine developed over years of strategic bombing theory. They should have worked. They failed completely. The problem was the weather. Japan's climate, particularly in winter, created conditions that made high-altitude precision bombing nearly impossible. Cloud cover obscured targets on 70% of missions. When crews could see through the clouds, they encountered another enemy, the jet stream. This high-altitude wind river, blowing at speeds up to 200 miles per hour, had never been encountered by American planners, whose experience was entirely European. Bombardiers trying to sight on targets found their aircraft being pushed sideways at speeds that made accurate bombing impossible. Even when bombs were released perfectly, the winds aloft scattered them across miles of Japanese countryside. Of the first 1,400 tons of bombs dropped on Tokyo in precision raids, fewer than 10% landed within 1,000 feet of their aim points. The mechanical problems were equally severe. The Wright R-3350 engines, rushed into production before their development was complete, proved catastrophically unreliable. The 18-cylinder radial engines ran hot under the best conditions. At high altitude, where they operated at maximum power to maintain height with heavy bomb loads, they overheated regularly. Engine fires became so common that crews developed dark humor about them. Magnesium engine components burned with white-hot intensity that firefighting systems could not suppress. Pilots learning to shut down burning engines, feather the propellers, and fly home on 3 engines or 2 became routine. Some aircraft burned and fell into the Pacific. Others limped back to emergency strips on Iwo Jima, which American forces were still fighting to secure, specifically to provide such emergency landing facilities. By late February 1945, General Henry Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces from Washington, was losing patience. The B-29 program had consumed resources equivalent to the Manhattan Project. Congress was asking pointed questions about why $3 billion had produced minimal results. The Navy was arguing that blockade and invasion would be more effective than strategic bombing. Most critically, American ground forces were preparing for the invasion of Japan itself, an operation that casualty estimates suggested would cost over 1 million American lives. The strategic bombing campaign was supposed to make that invasion unnecessary, or at least less costly. Instead, Japanese war production continued largely unaffected. Arnold relieved Hansel on January 20th, 1945, replacing him with Curtis LeMay, who arrived from the European theatre with a reputation for getting results regardless of cost. At 38 years old, LeMay was the youngest major general in the army. He had commanded bombing operations against Germany, developing the combat box formation that reduced bomber losses while increasing bombing accuracy. He was known for personal courage, often flying lead aircraft on the most dangerous missions. He was also known for ruthless pragmatism. When told that something could not be done, he found ways to do it anyway. LeMay spent his first month studying the problem. He flew on missions to observe conditions firsthand. He interviewed crews about what they encountered. He examined bombing photographs and damage assessments. He studied Japanese urban construction, learning that Japanese cities were fundamentally different from European targets. Where German cities were stone and concrete, Japanese cities were wood and paper. Where European industrial plants were concentrated in distinct districts, Japanese war production was dispersed through residential areas in thousands of small workshops. The Nakajima Aircraft Company, producing fighters and bombers, operated from 37 different locations across Tokyo. Precision bombing of such dispersed targets was impossible. More importantly, LeMay recognized that American advantages were being wasted. The B-29's sophisticated defensive armament was largely unnecessary. Japanese night fighter capabilities were minimal. Their anti-aircraft artillery, while numerous, lacked the radar fire control that made German flak so deadly. By flying at high altitude, American bombers were actually making themselves more vulnerable to the jet stream and weather, while gaining minimal protection from defenses that could not reach them effectively anyway. The bombing doctrine developed against Germany was being applied to Japan without considering whether Japanese conditions required different tactics. The solution that emerged was radical. Strip out most defensive armament and ammunition to reduce weight. Fly at 5,000 to 7,000 feet below the worst of the jet stream but above the effective range of most Japanese anti-aircraft guns. Attack at night to minimize fighter interception and take advantage of Japanese cities' lack of blackout discipline. Most critically, abandon precision bombing in favor of area attacks using incendiary weapons designed specifically to burn Japanese urban construction. The incendiary technology had been under development since 1942. The M69 bomb represented a triumph of chemical engineering applied to destruction. Each cluster bomb contained 47 individual bomblets, each weighing 6 pounds. The bomblets were filled with napalm, a jellied gasoline developed at Harvard University by chemists searching for a compound that would stick to targets and burn with intense heat. The napalm mixture combined gasoline with aluminum soap compounds that transformed liquid fuel into a gel that adhered to whatever it touched. When ignited, napalm burned at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel, more than sufficient to ignite wood and paper construction. The bomblets were designed to penetrate roofs before igniting, starting fires inside buildings where they would be hardest to extinguish. Testing had proven the concept. At Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, Army engineers had constructed replicas of Japanese residential districts, built with materials and methods identical to those used in Tokyo. German and Japanese architects who had emigrated to America advised on construction details. The mock-ups included narrow streets, closely packed wooden houses, paper walls, and tatami mat floors. When attacked with incendiaries, these test villages burned completely within minutes. The fires spread from building to building faster than firefighters could respond. Water supplies, designed for individual building fires, proved inadequate against conflagrations consuming entire blocks. The tests confirmed what LeMay suspected. Japanese cities were extraordinarily vulnerable to fire attacks. The tactical plan for what would be designated Special Bombing Mission No. 14 took shape in early March. 334 B-29s would attack Tokyo in a single night. They would approach in individual streams rather than formation, reducing mid-air collision risk and allowing continuous attack over several hours. The Pathfinder aircraft would mark the target area with quick-burning magnesium bombs, creating aiming points for following waves. The first wave would establish fires along the periphery of the target zone, creating a box of flames. Subsequent waves would bomb the interior, creating so many fires that they would merge into a single conflagration. Each aircraft would carry approximately 7 tons of M69 incendiary clusters, the maximum load possible with reduced defensive armament. The target zone was carefully selected, an area of northeast Tokyo roughly 3 miles by 4 miles, designated as Zone 1 by American planners, contained the highest concentration of war production facilities mixed with residential areas. Intelligence estimated that over 1 million people lived and worked in this zone. It included small factories producing aircraft components, machine shops, electronics assembly plants, and chemical works. All of this productive capacity was dispersed among wooden houses and shops, impossible to attack with precision weapons, but highly vulnerable to area fire. The operational orders stripped most defensive armament from the B-29s. Only the tail guns would be retained with ammunition. The top turrets, side guns, and belly turrets would be left unmanned. The weight savings from ammunition alone totaled 600 pounds per aircraft, equivalent to 12 additional M69 clusters. With reduced weight, the aircraft could carry maximum bomb loads, while flying at reduced altitude where the thinner air would require less engine power. The reduced power settings would decrease the engine overheating problems that had plagued high-altitude missions. LeMay understood the risks. Flying at low altitude made the bombers more vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. Removing defensive guns meant aircraft that were intercepted by fighters would be largely helpless. If Japanese defenses were more capable than intelligence suggested, or if they adapted quickly to the new tactics, losses could be catastrophic. Some planners estimated that 20% of the attacking force might be lost, over 60 aircraft and 600 crew members. For a single raid, such losses would be unsustainable. LeMay himself acknowledged that if the raid failed, his career would be over. But LeMay also recognized that continuing current tactics would certainly fail. The precision bombing campaign was achieving nothing while wearing out aircraft and crews. American industrial capacity was producing B-29s faster than they could be deployed, but crews took months to train. More importantly, the planned invasion of Japan was approaching. If strategic bombing could not significantly damage Japanese war production and morale before November 1945, then hundreds of thousands of American soldiers would pay the price. The briefings began on the afternoon of March 9th. Crews gathering in operations rooms across the Marianas heard plans that contradicted everything they had been trained to expect. When told they would fly at 5,000 feet, many thought it was a mistake. When informed that defensive ammunition would be minimal, some crews protested that they were being sent to their deaths. The briefing officers had to explain repeatedly that Japanese defenses were not as capable as German defenses had been, that the reduced altitude would actually improve survival by allowing faster speeds and better maneuverability. The target information was specific. The aiming point was the intersection of major roads in the Asakusa district, an area of dense mixed residential and industrial development. The weather forecast predicted clear skies over Tokyo with light winds, ideal conditions for incendiary attack. Intelligence estimated that Japanese fighter strength had been reduced by recent operations and that night fighter capabilities remained minimal. Anti-aircraft defenses were known to be concentrated around specific industrial facilities with lighter coverage over residential areas. The plan called for approaching the target from different directions to confuse defenders and prevent concentration of fire. As crews walked to their aircraft that evening, the weight of ordnance being loaded was visible. Each hardpoint under the wings and in the bomb bay carried clusters of M69s. Ground crews worked under portable lights, carefully checking release mechanisms and fusing. A single malfunction that dropped incendiaries near other parked aircraft could destroy dozens of B-29s before they ever left the ground. The fuel loads were calculated to the gallon, enough to reach Tokyo, execute the attack, and return with minimal reserve. Every pound of fuel was a pound that could not be bombs. The first aircraft lifted off from Northfield on Guam at 17:36 hours. Over the next 2 hours, 334 B-29s would take off from 3 fields, climbing slowly with their maximum loads, forming up over predetermined points before beginning the long flight north. The distances were staggering. Guam to Tokyo was nearly 1,500 miles, almost 6 hours of flying time. The bomber streams would arrive over the target between midnight and 3 a.m., attacking in continuous waves that would give Japanese firefighters no time to respond effectively. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Morgan, piloting the lead Pathfinder aircraft, crossed the Japanese coast at 00, 15 hours on March 10th. Flying at 7,500 feet, his bombardier, Captain Tom Woggerman, had clear visibility of Tokyo spread below. The city was partially blacked out, but enough light leaked from buildings and streets to make navigation possible. More importantly, Japanese searchlights and anti-aircraft fire revealed the locations of defensive positions. The Pathfinder crews would mark these for following aircraft to avoid. At 00, 15 hours, Morgan's bombardier released his load of 500-pound general-purpose bombs, mixed with M47 white phosphorus bombs designed to create brilliant fires for target marking. The white phosphorus ignited immediately upon impact, creating intense white flames visible for miles. Following Pathfinders added their own markers, creating a rough square of brilliant fires that defined the target area. The marking pattern worked perfectly. Crews approaching 20 minutes later could see the fires from over 50 miles away. The main force arrived at 00, 30 hours. Individual B-29SS approached from different directions, their bombardiers looking for the marked boundaries of the target zone. At altitudes between 5,000 and 7,000 feet, they encountered moderate anti-aircraft fire, less intense than expected. Japanese gunners, accustomed to tracking bombers at high altitude, struggled to adjust to the lower altitude tracks. Their fire control methods, largely based on optical sighting and manual calculation, could not track the faster-moving targets at close range. Most shells burst above or behind the attacking aircraft. The first wave of 100 bombers released their loads between 00, 30 and 100 hours. Over 1,800, some 69 clusters fell into the target area, each cluster breaking apart at 2,000 feet to scatter its 47 bomblets across a 100-yard radius. The bomblets tumbled down, penetrated roofs and windows, and ignited. Within minutes, hundreds of individual fires were burning across the target zone. The fires spread rapidly. Japanese urban construction, optimized for earthquake resistance with flexible wooden frames and lightweight walls, was catastrophically vulnerable to fire. Paper walls and screens offered no barrier. Tatami mat floors burned readily. The narrow streets designed for pedestrian and bicycle traffic rather than automobiles prevented effective firefighting response. The Tokyo Fire Department, with only 400 firefighters and minimal equipment, was immediately overwhelmed. The city's fire defense plan assumed fires would occur in isolated locations, could be surrounded, and contained. The plan never envisioned hundreds of simultaneous fires across several square miles. Within 15 minutes of the first bombs falling, the fire department had lost control. Individual fires began merging into larger conflagrations. The larger fires generated their own weather. As air heated and rose, cooler air rushed in from the sides, creating winds that fanned the flames and carried burning debris to start new fires. By 0100 hours, when the second wave of bombers arrived, the entire target area was beginning to glow with a dull red light visible from 30,000 feet. Crews in the second wave encountered conditions unlike anything in their training. The heat rising from the fires created severe turbulence. Aircraft were thrown upward by thermals, sometimes gaining several hundred feet in seconds. The smell of smoke penetrated even the sealed, pressurized cabins. The light from below was so intense that it hurt to look down at the bomb site. Captain Dale Pringle, piloting a B-29 in the second wave, later reported that his aircraft was thrown violently upward 3 times by rising heat, forcing him to dive to maintain his bombing altitude. His bombardier had difficulty seeing the aiming point through the smoke and glare. The heat inside the aircraft increased noticeably despite flying through air that should have been near freezing. The second wave dropped another 2,000 tons of incendiaries between 100 and 130 hours. By this time, the fires had completely merged. What had been hundreds of individual blazes was now a single firestorm consuming several square miles. The firestorm phenomenon, previously observed in Hamburg and Dresden, created a self-sustaining inferno. The intense heat created a powerful updraft at the center of the fire. Air rushing in from all sides to feed this updraft generated winds approaching 60 miles per hour at ground level. These winds carried burning debris horizontally, starting fires far beyond the original target zone. The winds also made escape impossible for people trapped in the area. Running from the flames, they ran into winds carrying fire toward them. The third and final wave arrived between 130 and 300 hours. These crews faced the worst conditions. The smoke column now reached 20,000 feet, forcing some aircraft to fly through it. Inside the smoke, visibility dropped to 0. Pilots relied entirely on instruments, while their bombardiers attempted to aim through breaks in the roiling clouds. The turbulence intensified. Multiple aircraft reported damage from extreme G-forces as they were thrown about. The radiant heat from below became severe enough that some crew members reported feeling uncomfortably warm despite the sub-freezing outside air temperature. Paint on the undersides of aircraft blistered from the heat. Yet the bombers continued to attack. The final wave dropped the remaining incendiaries, feeding the firestorm below. By 300 hours, when the last B-29 departed the target area, over 2,000 tons of incendiaries had fallen on Tokyo. An area of approximately 16 square miles was burning out of control. The firestorm would continue for 6 more hours before consuming everything combustible in the target zone. The magnitude of what was happening below the aircraft was not immediately clear to the attacking crews. They saw fires, certainly the most intense they had ever witnessed, but from 5,000 feet the human dimension was invisible. They could not see people fleeing through streets turned into corridors of flame. They could not hear the roar of the firestorm winds. They could not smell the smoke that was asphyxiating thousands who never felt the flames. On the ground, the reality was apocalyptic. Civilians in the target zone had approximately 15 minutes from the first incendiaries falling before escape became impossible. Those who fled immediately, moving against the tide of firefighters trying to reach the fires, survived. Those who delayed, trying to gather possessions or help neighbors, found themselves trapped as fires cut off escape routes. The narrow streets became death traps. As the firestorm intensified, fires on both sides of streets created unbearable radiant heat. People running through these corridors suffered severe burns without direct flame contact. Many collapsed from heat exhaustion or smoke inhalation before reaching safety. The canals that crossed Tokyo, normally useful fire breaks, became killing zones. Thousands jumped into the water to escape the flames. The water temperature rose as fire surrounded the canals on all sides. Many who survived the initial heat died from steam burns or drowning as exhausted people lost their grip on canal walls. Bodies piled up at bridges where crowds had tried to cross, only to be overtaken by fire. Air raid shelters, built to protect from explosive bombs, became ovens. The shelters were too shallow to provide protection from the intense heat above. Those who crowded inside seeking safety suffocated as the fires consumed oxygen or died from heat as temperatures inside exceeded survivable limits. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police Bureau, attempting to coordinate rescue efforts, lost communication with most stations in the target area within the first hour. Police officers reporting by telephone described conditions beyond their ability to manage. Entire city blocks were burning simultaneously. Hospitals were evacuating patients who were then trapped in streets with nowhere to go. Schools designated as emergency shelters were burning. The police academy, fortified as a rally point, was surrounded by fire, its occupants trapped. The few fire trucks that reached the area found water mains destroyed by the heat, leaving them unable to fight fires. Firefighters attempting to advance on foot were forced back by the intense radiant heat. By 0300 hours, when the last bombs fell, the fire had consumed approximately 1/4 of the target zone. The firestorm continued expanding as winds carried burning material into adjacent areas. The peak intensity occurred between 0400 and 0600 hours. During this period, winds at ground level reached their maximum, estimated at 60 to 70 miles per hour. The updraft at the center of the firestorm was strong enough to lift heavy debris thousands of feet into the air. Burning timbers were carried by these winds and started fires over a mile from the main conflagration. The temperature at street level in the center of the firestorm exceeded 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Dawn on March 10th revealed the magnitude of destruction. An area of 16 square miles containing an estimated 250,000 buildings had been reduced to ash and rubble. The destruction was nearly complete within this zone. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed only concrete structures remaining, and even these were burned out shells. Wooden construction had been so completely consumed that street patterns were barely visible. The only landmarks were major roads and canals. Everything else was a uniform grey wasteland of ash. The human casualties were catastrophic. The Tokyo Metropolitan Government eventually estimated that between 100,000 and 120,000 people died in the attack. The exact number would never be known. Entire families were wiped out with no survivors to report them missing. Many bodies were completely consumed by the intense heat, leaving no remains to count. Others died in canals and were washed away or in collapsed shelters that were never fully excavated. The government's official count, conducted over months, identified 87,000 confirmed dead, but acknowledged this was certainly an undercount. Modern historians generally accept estimates between 100,000 and 120,000 deaths. This made the Tokyo firebombing the single deadliest air attack in history, surpassing the death toll from the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The injured numbered over 1 million. Burns, smoke inhalation, and trauma from fleeing through the firestorm affected hundreds of thousands. Tokyo's hospitals, already overcrowded with military and civilian casualties, were completely overwhelmed. Medical supplies were critically short. Many injured received no treatment beyond basic first aid. The psychological trauma affected virtually everyone in the city. Even those outside the target zone had watched the firestorm, heard the roar of flames, and saw the smoke column that towered miles into the sky. The demonstration that American bombers could destroy large sections of the city in a single night shattered public confidence in air defenses. Over 1 million people became homeless. The target zone had housed approximately 1.3 million residents in the densely packed wooden houses. Most survivors lost everything except what they could carry while fleeing. Refugee camps sprang up in parks, temple grounds, and any open space outside the burn zone. The displaced overwhelmed social services. Food distribution systems collapsed under the load. Water supplies were contaminated by ash and debris. Disease became a serious concern as sanitation systems failed under the refugee burden. The Tokyo government, already stretched thin by years of war, struggled to provide basic services to the displaced population. The industrial damage was severe but difficult to quantify precisely. The target zone contained thousands of small workshops and factories producing war materials. Estimates suggest that 20% of Tokyo's industrial production capacity was destroyed in the single raid. However, the dispersed nature of Japanese war production meant that much manufacturing could be relocated to undamaged areas. More significant was the psychological impact on the workforce. Absenteeism skyrocketed after the raid as workers feared being trapped in their factories during attacks. Production dropped not just from destroyed facilities but from reduced worker availability and morale. The returning B-29 crews brought back reports that stunned planners. Aircraft had encountered only moderate anti-aircraft fire with no fighter interception. 14 B-29s were lost, a loss rate of just over 4%, well within acceptable limits. Most losses appeared to be from mechanical problems rather than enemy action. Several aircraft crashed on takeoff or landing due to engine failures. Others ditched in the ocean when fuel ran short. Only a handful showed damage from anti-aircraft fire. The absence of significant defences validated LeMay's tactical changes and suggested that further attacks using similar methods would be feasible. The bomb damage assessment photographs revealed destruction beyond what planners had anticipated. The 16 square miles of total destruction exceeded the target's own dimensions. The fires had spread beyond the intended boundaries, consuming additional residential and commercial areas. The completeness of destruction was remarkable. In European raids, even heavy attacks typically left many buildings damaged but standing. In Tokyo, virtually nothing remained within the burned zone. The fires had been so hot and so complete that even concrete structures were gutted shells. The success exceeded the most optimistic predictions and suggested that similar attacks against other Japanese cities would be equally effective. Curtis LeMay, reviewing the results on March 11th, understood that he had discovered Japan's fundamental vulnerability. The combination of wooden construction, high population density, and limited firefighting capabilities made Japanese cities extraordinarily susceptible to incendiary attack. The tactical changes, flying low with maximum bomb loads and minimal defensive armament, had proven successful beyond hopes. The low loss rate meant such attacks could be sustained indefinitely. Most importantly, the massive destruction from a single raid proved that strategic bombing could achieve decisive effects against Japan without the prolonged campaigns that had been necessary in Europe. Within 48 hours of the Tokyo attack, LeMay had ordered follow-up raids against Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. On March 11th, nearly 300 B-29 air attacked Nagoya using identical tactics, burning 3 square miles and killing over 2,000. On March 13th, 274 aircraft attacked Osaka, destroying over 8 square miles and killing an estimated 4,000. On March 16th, 307 B-29s attacked Kobe, burning 3 square miles and killing over 2,000. In 10 days, 5 major Japanese cities had suffered catastrophic firebomb attacks that destroyed approximately 32 square miles of urban area and killed over 130,000 civilians. The Japanese government was paralyzed by the attacks. The scale of destruction exceeded anything they had experienced or imagined. The army had assured the population that American bombers could be stopped, that civil defenses could protect against air attack. Both claims were now proven false. The military proposed various countermeasures: more anti-aircraft guns, more night fighters, better civil defense organization, but none could be implemented quickly enough to matter. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to manufacture sufficient weapons. The few night fighters available were obsolete and ineffective against B-29s. Civil defense improvements required resources and organization that no longer existed in the chaos following the attacks. The psychological impact on Japanese morale was profound. The government had maintained that Japan's fighting spirit would overcome American material advantages, that Japanese determination and sacrifice would prevail against American softness and war weariness. The firebombing demonstrated that American industry could produce destruction on a scale that the Japanese spirit could not resist. Civilians who had endured years of rationing, conscription, and hardship now faced literal incineration from an enemy they could neither see nor fight. The attacks undermined confidence in the government and military leadership that had promised victory and delivered only devastation. The firebombing campaign continued through the spring and summer of 1945. By July, when LeMay temporarily ran out of targets, over 60 Japanese cities had been attacked with incendiaries. Approximately 178 square miles of urban area had been destroyed. Over 400,000 civilians were dead. Over 8 million were homeless. Japan's war production had been cut by more than half, not just from destroyed factories, but from the displacement of workers and disruption of transportation networks. The attacks achieved what precision bombing had failed to accomplish: the systematic destruction of Japan's ability to continue the war. The strategic effects extended beyond the physical damage. Japanese naval and air forces, already crippled by combat losses, found their remaining capabilities further degraded as attacks destroyed fuel storage, ammunition dumps, and spare parts depots. The transportation system, dependent on rail and coastal shipping, broke down as marshalling yards and port facilities burned. Food distribution to cities became unreliable, creating the threat of mass starvation. The government was forced to devote increasing resources to air defense and civil defense, resources that could not be used for military operations. The cumulative effect was to accelerate Japan's economic collapse and create conditions where continued resistance became logistically impossible. The moral and ethical questions raised by the firebombing remain debated. The attacks deliberately targeted civilian areas, killing over 400,000 non-combatants. The justifications offered at the time included the argument that Japanese cities contained dispersed war production, making them legitimate military targets, the claim that attacking civilian morale would hasten Japanese surrender and reduce overall casualties, and the assertion that anything that weakened Japan's ability to resist invasion was militarily necessary. Critics then, and later, argued that the attacks constituted war crimes under international law, that deliberately killing civilians was never justified regardless of military necessity, and that the scale of destruction exceeded any legitimate military purpose. The debate has never been resolved. What is indisputable is that the March 9th Tokyo raid marked a fundamental shift in the conduct of the war. The tactical success validated area bombing with incendiaries as the most effective method of attacking Japanese cities. The low loss rates proved that such attacks could be sustained indefinitely. The massive destruction demonstrated that American industrial capacity could produce not just precision weapons, but apocalyptic devastation. The psychological impact showed that attacks on civilian morale could complement attacks on military capacity. In 6 hours, one raid killed more people than months of precision bombing. In 10 days, a series of raids destroyed more industrial capacity than all previous B-29 operations combined. The Tokyo firestorm changed the war by proving that American air power could achieve strategic effects against Japan without the massive casualties that invasion would require. The demonstration of American capacity to destroy Japanese cities at will influenced Japanese calculations about continued resistance. While not immediately decisive, the firebombing campaign created conditions that made Japanese surrender more likely and invasion less necessary. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, they were devastating but not qualitatively different from what Japanese cities had already experienced. The firebombing had already demonstrated that America possessed the means and will to destroy Japan from the air. Curtis LeMay never expressed regret for the Tokyo raid. In post-war interviews, he defended the attack as militarily necessary and effective. He acknowledged the massive civilian casualties, but argued that they were unavoidable consequences of Japanese industrial dispersal and the determination to end the war as quickly as possible. He pointed out that the invasion of Japan would have killed far more people, both American and Japanese, than the bombing campaign. His defenders note that he achieved his mission of destroying Japan's capacity to continue the war, hastening surrender and saving lives in the aggregate. His critics argue that deliberately killing civilians on such a scale could never be justified, that the attacks violated fundamental principles of proportionality and discrimination in warfare. The night of March 9th and morning of March 10th, 1945, remains one of the most destructive events in human history. In 6 hours, over 100,000 people died. In 10 days of follow-up raids, another 30,000 died. The firebombing campaign that continued through August killed over 400,000 civilians total. The scale of destruction was unprecedented, exceeding anything achieved in Europe despite years of Allied bombing. The single Tokyo raid killed more people than the entire London Blitz. It killed more people than the atomic bomb at Nagasaki. Only Hiroshima exceeded its death toll in a single attack. The tactical and technological lessons influenced post-war air doctrine. The effectiveness of incendiaries against urban targets was noted. The vulnerability of unprotected cities to area attacks was demonstrated. The importance of weather and altitude selection was confirmed. The ability to trade defensive armament for bomb load was validated. These lessons shaped strategic bombing planning for decades. influencing everything from Korean War operations to Cold War nuclear targeting. The concept of producing mass destruction through sustained conventional attacks rather than single precision strikes became doctrine. The B-29 itself proved to be the right weapon at the right time. Its long range allowed attacks from bases beyond Japanese defensive capabilities. Its heavy bomb load made mass attacks possible without impractically large formations. Its pressurized cabin allowed crews to operate effectively for the duration of 12-hour missions. Its reliability, while problematic early on, improved to the point where operations could be sustained at high tempo. American industry produced over 3,000 B-29s during the war, allowing sustained operations despite combat and mechanical losses. The Superfortress made the firebombing campaign possible. The M69 incendiary bomb demonstrated the application of chemistry to warfare. The napalm filling burned hot enough to ignite resistant materials. Its adhesive properties prevented firefighting efforts. The cluster design allowed wide area coverage from individual bombs. The delayed fusing ensured penetration into buildings before ignition. The combination created fires that spread faster than defenders could respond. Later incendiary designs built on the M69 concept, improving efficiency and destructive power. Napalm weapons would be used extensively in Korea and Vietnam, their origin traceable to the weapons developed for the Tokyo raid. The night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, demonstrated that American industrial capacity applied to destruction could produce effects beyond anything previously imagined. The coordination required to launch 334 bombers from multiple bases, navigate them individually over 1,500 miles of ocean, concentrate their attacks on a single target within a 3-hour window, and return them safely required organizational capability that few nations possessed. The ability to produce thousands of tons of specialized incendiary weapons and deliver them across the Pacific demonstrated logistics capabilities unprecedented in warfare. The willingness to radically change tactics based on results rather than doctrine showed adaptability that traditional military organizations struggled to match. For Japan, the Tokyo firestorm marked the beginning of the end. The demonstration that American air power could destroy Japanese cities at will, with minimal losses, made clear that continued resistance was ultimately futile. While Japan would not surrender for another 5 months, the firebombing campaign created conditions that made surrender inevitable. The destruction of industrial capacity, displacement of millions, and psychological impact undermined the government's ability to continue the war. When the emperor finally decided to surrender in August, the cumulative effects of the firebombing campaign were among the factors that made continued resistance appear hopeless. The Tokyo firestorm stands as one of the most controversial events of World War II, celebrated by some as a necessary step toward ending the war and condemned by others as an atrocity. What remains undeniable is its historical significance. The night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, changed the war by demonstrating that air power alone could achieve strategic effects previously requiring ground invasion. It validated Curtis LeMay's tactical revolution and condemned to death over 100,000 civilians in a single night. It marked the moment when American industrial might applied to the systematic destruction of urban areas proved capable of effects that shocked even those who ordered them. The morning after the raid brought full comprehension to the American planners who had designed the attack. Major General Hayward Hansell, the commander LeMay had replaced, learned of the results from his new assignment in the United States. In later years, he would express profound ambivalence about what his successor had accomplished. Hansell had believed in precision bombing not just as doctrine but as moral necessity. The idea that strategic bombing should focus on military and industrial targets, minimizing civilian casualties, reflected deeply held convictions about how civilized nations should wage war. The Tokyo firestorm represented everything Hansell had worked to avoid: deliberate mass killing of non-combatants on a scale that made precision bombing's pretensions to restraint seem naive. Yet even Hansell acknowledged the tactical success. The results from one night of firebombing exceeded everything his months of precision attacks had achieved. In 6 hours, more damage was inflicted on Japanese war production than in all previous B-29 operations combined. The loss rate was a fraction of what precision daylight raids had suffered. The psychological impact was profound in ways that hitting individual factories could never be. From a purely military perspective, LeMay's approach was demonstrably superior. The moral cost was another question entirely. General Henry Arnold, receiving the preliminary reports in Washington, recognized immediately that the campaign's entire trajectory had shifted. The B-29 program, which had been on the verge of being declared a failure, was suddenly vindicated. Congress would stop asking pointed questions about the $3 billion investment. The Navy would have to acknowledge that strategic bombing could contribute decisively to victory. Most importantly, Arnold could report to President Truman and the Joint Chiefs that the air campaign against Japan was finally achieving significant results. The invasion of Japan, scheduled for November 1945, might be unnecessary if the bombing campaign continued to produce such effects. Arnold authorized LeMay to continue firebombing operations without restriction. The phrase used in communications was that LeMay had discretion to attack targets using methods he deemed most effective. This deliberately vague authorization gave LeMay cover to continue area attacks while allowing senior leaders to maintain some deniability about targeting civilians. The moral responsibility was being diffused through the chain of command in ways that would become characteristic of strategic bombing decisions throughout the Cold War. The production of incendiary munitions accelerated dramatically. Chemical plants across the United States increased napalm production. Bomb assembly facilities worked around the clock to meet demand. By April 1945, American industry was producing incendiary bombs at rates that exceeded the B-29 force's ability to deliver them. Hundreds of thousands of M69 clusters accumulated in Pacific Island depots, waiting for aircraft to carry them to Japanese cities. The manufacturing capacity existed to sustain the firebombing campaign indefinitely, limited only by the number of bombers and crews available. The transportation network supporting the campaign was itself a marvel of logistics. Liberty ships carried bombs from West Coast ports to Pacific Island bases, a journey of over 6,000 miles that took 3 weeks. Once unloaded at Saipan, Tinian, or Guam, the bombs had to be moved from docks to storage bunkers, then to hard stands where ground crews would load them onto aircraft. Each B-29 mission required approximately 50 tons of bombs across the formation, meaning that a single raid consumed the cargo capacity of multiple ships. The continuous stream of supplies flowing across the Pacific demonstrated American logistical capabilities that Japan could never match. The crews flying these missions had mixed reactions to the new tactics. Some were relieved that the low-altitude attacks produced lower loss rates than high-altitude precision bombing had. The reduced time at altitude meant less exposure to engine problems and cold. The absence of fighter opposition meant that stripping defensive guns was not as dangerous as initially feared. The ability to see results, watching fires spread across target areas, provided immediate feedback that high-altitude bombing had lacked. For crews concerned primarily with their own survival and mission success, the new tactics were superior in nearly every measurable way. Others were troubled by what they were doing. Flying at lower altitude meant they could see more detail on the ground. They could see people fleeing through streets. They could see buildings collapsing in flames. They could smell the smoke even through their oxygen masks. Some crews reported that the smell of burning flesh was detectable at 5,000 feet, though this may have been psychological rather than actual. The psychological burden of killing civilians in such numbers affected some crew members profoundly. Post-mission debriefings included reports of crew members becoming physically ill during attacks or expressing doubts about continuing the campaign. The military chaplains attached to B-29 groups found themselves counseling increasing numbers of airmen struggling with moral questions about the bombing campaign. The chaplains had no good answers. They could offer spiritual comfort and remind the crews that they were following orders in a just war. They could point out that Japanese civilians were complicit in supporting their government's aggression. They could argue that hastening the war's end would save lives overall. But none of these arguments fully satisfied men who had watched cities burn and knew they had killed thousands of civilians who had no personal role in military operations. The statistical analysis of the campaign showed remarkable efficiency. The average B-29 sortie in firebombing operations destroyed approximately 25 times more industrial capacity than the average precision bombing sortie had. The cost per ton of damage inflicted dropped by a factor of 10. The loss rate per effective sortie dropped by 60%. From the perspective of operations research, The shift to incendiary area bombing represented optimal use of available resources. The B-29s were achieving their strategic purpose more efficiently than they had under precision doctrine. The human cost was external to these calculations. By April 1945, LeMay had refined the tactics further. The Pathfinder aircraft now marked targets with greater precision, using radar bombing techniques when visual identification was difficult. The spacing between aircraft was optimized to maximize the rate of bombs falling on target, while minimizing collision risk. The bomb loads were varied to include a mix of incendiaries and high-explosive bombs, with the explosives designed to disrupt firefighting efforts and damage water mains. The attacks became more systematic and more lethal with each iteration. The second major Tokyo raid occurred on April 13th, targeting commercial and residential areas along the western edge of the city that had escaped the March attack. Over 300 B-29 era dropped 1,800 tons of incendiaries, burning an additional 7 square miles and killing an estimated 12,000 people. The death toll was lower than the March raid because many residents had already evacuated after witnessing the earlier firestorm. The economic impact was severe regardless, as the burned areas contained major rail yards and warehouses that were crucial to Tokyo's logistics network. The raid on Nagoya on May 14th demonstrated the evolution of tactics. The target was selected not just for industrial capacity, but for weather conditions that would maximize fire spread. Intelligence indicated strong winds in the Nagoya area that night. The attack plan positioned the initial fires to take advantage of prevailing winds, ensuring that burning debris would be carried into unburned areas. Over 470 B-29s participated, the largest single raid to that point. The fires consumed over 3 square miles despite better firefighting preparations than Tokyo had managed. The Mitsubishi aircraft plants in Nagoya suffered severe damage, crippling production of fighters desperately needed to defend against B-29 raids. The Japanese military's response to the firebombing campaign was constrained by limited resources and the overwhelming scale of American attacks. Anti-aircraft gun production increased, but the guns took months to manufacture and deploy. When guns reached defensive positions, they often lacked sufficient ammunition due to transportation breakdowns. Fire control systems remained primitive, relying on optical sighting that was largely ineffective against aircraft at 5,000 feet flying at 300 miles per hour. Japanese gunners scored hits, but the hit rate was so low that it did not significantly affect American operations. The fighter response was equally ineffective. The Japanese Army and Navy Air Forces had prioritized intercepting B-29s at high altitude, where the American bombers had previously operated. When the raids shifted to low-altitude night attacks, the Japanese night fighter force was woefully inadequate. Japan had only about 100 night fighters operational in the home islands, most of them obsolete twin-engine aircraft with limited performance. The crews were poorly trained in night interception techniques. The ground control system lacked effective radar. Even when Japanese fighters located the bomber streams, their light armament often proved insufficient to bring down the heavily built B-29s. Several Japanese pilots achieved success against the B-29s despite these obstacles. Captain Isamu Kashid of the 53rd Sentai developed tactics for attacking B-29s from below, where their defensive armament was lightest. He claimed 6 B-29s shot down before being killed in action himself in May 1945. Lieutenant Sadamu Kamachi pioneered ramming attacks, deliberately colliding with B-29s when his ammunition ran out. He survived 3 such attacks before dying in a 4th. These individual successes could not offset the overwhelming numerical and technological advantages the Americans possessed. The civilian response to the firebombing evolved from shock to grim acceptance. After the March Tokyo raid, millions of Japanese civilians evacuated cities for rural areas, believing correctly that American bombers would continue targeting urban centers. This mass evacuation severely disrupted war production as workers fled their jobs. Schools were closed and children sent to the countryside. Government offices relocated to smaller cities believed to be less likely targets. The social fabric of Japanese urban life essentially collapsed under the bombing campaign's pressure. Those who remained in cities adapted as best they could. Neighborhoods organized fire watches that maintained 24-hour vigilance for air raids. Residents dug improvised shelters and stockpiled water for firefighting. Families practiced evacuation drills, determining escape routes and assembly points. These preparations proved largely futile against firestorm conditions, but they provided psychological comfort and occupied people's time. The ritual of preparing for raids gave structure to daily life that had otherwise become dominated by fear and uncertainty. The Japanese government's civil defense instructions became increasingly disconnected from reality. Citizens were told to fight fires with bucket brigades and beat out flames with wet mats. They were instructed to remain at their posts unless specifically ordered to evacuate. They were assured that American bombing was militarily ineffective and that the Japanese spirit would prevail. These instructions bore no relationship to the actual conditions of a firestorm, where temperatures exceeded 1,000 degrees, winds approached hurricane force, and fleeing immediately was the only survival strategy. The disconnect between official instructions and actual experience further undermined public confidence in the government. The May 25th Tokyo raid marked another escalation. LeMay ordered a daylight attack on the Imperial Palace area and government district, sending 520 B-29s in the largest raid to date. The target selection was partially political, demonstrating that no area of Tokyo was immune. The raid destroyed the palace's outer grounds and severely damaged government buildings, though the emperor's residence itself was deliberately spared. Over 4,000 people died, and another 7 square miles burned. The psychological impact of attacking the symbolic heart of Japan was profound, suggesting to many Japanese that surrender was inevitable. By June 1945, LeMay faced an unexpected problem. He was running out of targets. Over 60 Japanese cities had been attacked with varying degrees of success. The largest cities, Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Yokohama, had suffered multiple raids that destroyed most of their urban areas. Medium-sized cities had been attacked systematically. The target list was being expanded to include increasingly small cities with limited military significance. Some targets were towns of under 50,000 population with almost no industrial capacity. The campaign was approaching the point where it would be attacking targets purely for psychological effect rather than military value. The destruction statistics by midsummer 1945 were staggering. 178 square miles of Japanese urban area had been burned. Over 400,000 civilians were dead from the combined raids. 8 million people were homeless. Industrial production had dropped by more than half from peak levels. Transportation networks were severely disrupted. Food distribution was breaking down. The attacks had achieved their strategic purpose of crippling Japan's ability to continue the war. Whether they had been necessary to achieve this outcome or whether Japan might have collapsed from blockade and conventional operations alone remained an unanswerable question. The atomic bomb program had been proceeding in parallel with the firebombing campaign. When the successful Trinity test occurred on July 16, 1945, American planners had to decide whether to continue conventional bombing or wait for atomic weapons to become available. The decision was made to continue both. Conventional raids would maintain pressure on Japan while atomic weapons were prepared. The two approaches were seen as complementary rather than alternative strategies. In retrospect, this decision meant that Hiroshima and Nagasaki would be attacked with atomic weapons after Japanese cities had already experienced destruction of comparable magnitude through conventional means. The firebombing continued right up until Japan's surrender. The last major raid occurred on August 14th, hours before the Emperor's surrender announcement. Over 800 B-29 attacked multiple cities in what was intended as a demonstration that American air power could sustain maximum effort operations indefinitely. The crews flying these final missions knew that surrender was imminent. Some questioned the necessity of continuing to kill Japanese civilians when the war was effectively over. Others argued that maintaining pressure until the formal surrender prevented Japan from backing out of negotiations. The debate reflected the moral ambiguity that had characterized the entire firebombing campaign. When Japan surrendered on August 15th, the B-29 campaign stood as one of the most destructive strategic bombing efforts in history. The aircraft designed for precision attacks had instead delivered area destruction on an unprecedented scale. The doctrine of attacking military and industrial targets had evolved into systematic burning of urban areas. The principle of minimizing civilian casualties had been abandoned in favor of maximizing destruction. The transformation reflected the brutal logic of total war, where achieving victory justified methods that would have been unthinkable in earlier conflicts. Curtis LeMay emerged from the war as one of America's most successful and controversial commanders. His tactical innovations had broken the stalemate in the air war against Japan and demonstrated the effectiveness of strategic bombing. His willingness to discard ineffective doctrine in favor of methods that worked marked him as a pragmatic leader willing to take risks. His responsibility for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians made him, in the eyes of critics, a war criminal who escaped prosecution only because his side won. LeMay himself was characteristically blunt about his legacy, stating in post-war interviews that if America had lost the war, he expected he would have been tried for war crimes. He believed his actions were justified by military necessity and by the argument that they shortened the war and saved lives overall. The B-29 crews who flew the missions had their own reckonings with what they had done. Many suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though the condition was not well understood at the time. Some struggled with guilt over their role in killing civilians, others rationalized their actions as necessary to end the war and save American lives that would have been lost in an invasion. A few took pride in having helped defeat Japan and saw no moral problem with their missions. The diversity of reactions reflected the complexity of moral judgment in wartime, where individual conscience confronted military duty and survival instinct. The night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, stands as a watershed moment when the nature of strategic bombing shifted fundamentally. The Tokyo firestorm demonstrated that modern industrial powers could produce destruction of almost unlimited scale if they chose to do so. The restraints that had limited earlier bombing campaigns, technical limitations, resource constraints, moral considerations, all proved surmountable when military necessity demanded it. The precedent established that night would influence strategic thinking throughout the Cold War, where nuclear weapons promised destruction orders of magnitude greater than what conventional firebombing had achieved. The human cost of the Tokyo firestorm cannot be reduced to statistics, though the numbers are worth remembering. Over 100,000 people died, most of them women, children, and elderly men, as military-age males were serving in the armed forces. Each death represented an individual with hopes, fears, relationships, and dreams. Each family destroyed meant orphans, widows, and parents who had lost children. The survivors carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The city itself bore scars visible for decades, with entire neighborhoods that remained empty lots until the 1960s because reconstruction resources were needed elsewhere. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan achieved its military objectives. Japanese war production was crippled. Transportation networks were disrupted. Civilian morale was shattered. The government's ability to continue the war was severely compromised. These results contributed to Japan's decision to surrender, though how much they contributed compared to the atomic bombs, Soviet entry into the war, and the naval blockade remains debated by historians. What is clear is that the firebombing made continued Japanese resistance increasingly futile by systematically destroying the infrastructure necessary to sustain military operations. The legacy of the Tokyo firestorm extends beyond World War II. The tactics developed by LeMay influenced strategic bombing doctrine for decades. The concept of using incendiaries against urban areas was applied in Korea, where American bombers burned North Korean cities. It was applied in Vietnam, where napalm became a signature weapon of the air campaign. The willingness to inflict massive civilian casualties in pursuit of military objectives became embedded in American strategic thinking, justified by the precedent that such methods had helped win World War II. Critics argue this legacy normalized war crimes and created a culture where civilian suffering was treated as an acceptable cost of military operations. The moral questions raised by the firebombing campaign have never been resolved satisfactorily. International law regarding the protection of civilians in wartime has evolved significantly since 1945, partly in response to the experiences of World War II. The Geneva Conventions were revised to provide stronger protections for non-combatants. The concept of proportionality, requiring that military operations not inflict civilian harm excessive compared to military advantage gained, became more firmly established. Yet these legal developments came after the fact and could not undo what had happened in Tokyo and dozens of other Japanese cities. The Tokyo firestorm changed the war by demonstrating that American air power could achieve strategic effects through systematic urban destruction. It changed warfare by establishing precedents for how civilian populations could be targeted in pursuit of military objectives. It changed history by contributing to Japan's decision to surrender and by influencing how future conflicts would be fought. The night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, stands as one of the most significant and troubling events of the 20th century, a moment when technological capability, military necessity, and moral compromise converged to produce destruction of almost incomprehensible scale. The fires that burned through Tokyo that night cast shadows that extend to the present day, raising questions about the nature of warfare and the limits of acceptable conduct that each generation must answer for itself.